Hi, my name is Alex Tabor, and this is my ANS 561 Equine Nutrition Hot Topic presentation. I chose to do my presentation on feeding an orphan foal. This was actually my number one choice, and I've always really found foals to be very interesting. For my 4-H production project, I raised 2 baby foals, and I actually showed both of them, and I still own both of them. They're mother and daughter. So I just really find foals to be fascinating. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to do my presentation on. So for whatever reason that would cause you to have an orphan foal, sometimes it can be due to the death of the mother. It can be due to a mare that has a job or a career that prevents her from being able to raise the foal herself. So then the options that you have with your orphan foal, you can have a nurse mare that takes care of the foal, or you can hand rear the foal with a bottle or a bucket, kind of like how you would raise like a dairy cow calf. So some advantages of having a nurse mare. A nurse mare would be an appropriate role model for the foal. So if anybody has ever had any experience with a foal that was raised by humans, sometimes they can have really annoying habits, and they're obviously extremely comfortable and don't have too many, they don't understand human boundaries quite as well as they should. So having a nurse mare has the appropriate like equine model that teaches the foals how they should be. Also having a nurse mare, they are self-sufficient, so it's less work. You don't have to be responsible for feeding the foal multiple times a day. Some disadvantages of having a nurse mare is they're not always available. It can be depending on the time of the year where you're located, or if you're just a small farm with just one mare and your mare died and you have a foal, it might not be an option for you to be able to go get a nurse mare. They're not always compatible, so if the nurse mare has had time to bond with her own foal, or if the orphan foal had bonded with its mother already, sometimes it can be a hard transition to have the foal and the nurse mare be together. Sometimes having a nurse mare, there can be an agreement that when you return the nurse mare that you're going to have her bred. So if you're, again, a facility or place in which you're just raising mares, you don't have access to a stallion, this could be difficult. Or if you're just like a single place and you have just your one orphan foal, you might not have a stallion that you could use. And mares that are 4 to 6 weeks into their lactation, their milk changes, the quality of their milk, and it might not be sufficient to sustain a neonate. So if you have a baby that's 2 or 3 days old that was now an orphan, the milk from the mare might not be sufficient to take care of the neonate. So your options, if you're not going to use a nurse mare, you would be hand rearing. So you'd be using a bottle or a bucket. So advantage of having the bucket is it can prevent some of the unwanted behaviors associated with feeding from a bottle. So if anybody's ever gone into like a barn in which they have a bunch of dairy calves and they're in their little wire hutches, anytime you walk by, they think, oh, you're going to feed me, and they might be reaching their heads out and they try to like suck on your clothes and try to get a hold of any piece of you that they can because they think that you're going to feed them. So some of those behaviors can be picked up by the foals. And it's not as necessarily as big of an issue when they are little, when they're teeny babies, but once they get to be full size, some of these issues can become like very big issues, and they can be kind of dangerous to people. Feeding out of a bucket also requires less labor, so you don't have to stand there and hold a bottle for the baby to nurse. You can just leave the bucket and it can kind of take care of itself whenever it's ready. And then just a general note, foals that are 7 to 10 days of age are more difficult to bucket train because they've had 7 to 10 days to nurse from their mother, so it can be like a hard transition to be on a bucket. So to bucket train, it's best to isolate the foal in a deeply bedded stall for 2 to 4 hours after its last meal. This is supposed to stimulate the appetite. If you've ever, I live on a dairy farm, so my experience has been with dairy calves. So whenever we're trying to teach the dairy calves, which is the same with an orphan foal, to drink out of a bucket from a bottle, you can use your finger, or some people use a nipple. I find it easier to use your finger to try to, they'll suck on your finger and you can direct them towards the bucket. And most of the foals will learn between 12 and 24 hours how to drink out of a bucket. When it's there, most of the time they're kind of curious enough that they'll start to try to play in it and they'll figure out that that's where it is. Usually the issue is knowing that like when you start sucking that the milk is going to come up into your mouth. So that's kind of the idea. If you put your finger down in the bucket and they suck your finger and they suck some of the milk around it, then they'll realize that the milk comes from in the bucket. If you're going to be feeding your foal, you're going to need to kind of decide what you're going to be feeding it. So you can feed some milk replacers, and this should be chosen based on your quality, performance, acceptability, and nutritional profile of the milk replacers. So some options that you have for milk replacers, you can feed, these are replacers, but you can feed cow milk, goat milk, or mare milk. Some replacers that are available are calf milk, lamb milk, or kid milk. And in the next couple slides, I'm going to show you a few tables that'll show you some of like the comparisons for the different types of replacers and actually the milk from a cow, a goat, or a mare, so you can kind of see the difference in each of them. So this is a table, and on the left side there actually shows milk from a mare, a cow, and a goat, and then on the right side it shows different milk replacers that are like actually products that you can buy. So if you look kind of through the comparison of the milk, you can see on the left side there what mares generally have in their milk. And then in the middle you can kind of see the cow. So cow's semi-similar. It's got a slightly higher protein, slightly a good bit higher fat, but not nearly the carbohydrates in it that mare's milk has. And there's a lot more zinc in cow's milk than in mare's milk. And then on the other side of the cow's milk is your goat milk. So kind of, again, similar. Also has higher fat, but again, less carbohydrates even than that of the cow's milk, and a little bit closer as far as zinc goes. Lots of people seem to like to feed goat's milk to foals, but an issue that's come from that is there can be poor weight gain, and it can cause metabolic acidosis when you're feeding goat's milk. At least that's when you're feeding 135 kilocalories per kilogram per day. So again, obviously it's not going to be mare's milk, so it's not going to be perfect regardless. But just some considerations, poor weight gain could be an issue. And then on the right side, just some 3 choices that you would have if you wanted to feed an actual replacer. Just a note about replacers, if you're going to be feeding a replacer, you should mix up exactly what you need. So you don't want to mix up like a bunch and just save it, because it can go bad. So here we have a table, and this talks about the estimated calories and volume of a mare's milk needed by a foal. So this kind of just, you can see kind of what you need to have for your foal depending on the age and when you actually need to try to take care of the foal, since the mare is not going to be there. So just some values for you in case you were interested. And then this is just a report about how much your foal should be growing. So I made the comment that goat's milk had poor weight gain, so you can kind of see how much weight they should be putting on within like the week, and looks about 1.5 kilograms or so, and obviously it decreases a little bit over time. And then you can see the height at which they should be growing. So if you would compare this to like foals that were on goat's milk, you would be able to see like the difference that they were talking about, that it can have poor weight gain. And then on this table, this is just your general nutrient recommendations for foals, weanlings, and yearlings. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but you can kind of see on there what each one needs and how that changes over time. So some special considerations when you're feeding your orphan foal: products that contain maltodectin, corn syrup, oligosaccharides, and glucose polymers are not recommended for foals that are less than 3 weeks of age. And this is because whenever the foals come out, their GI tracts are not filled with the bacteria that they need, and there's also low maltase activity in the foal's small intestines, so it can lead to diarrhea. And carbohydrates are not digested; they are fermented by the microbial population in the gut. So if you're feeding excessive carbohydrates, there can be excessive gas production, and you can also have diarrhea. So the biggest problem with foals and diarrhea, or even with like calves and diarrhea, if they develop diarrhea or they get to be dehydrated, it can just be like a day or two that you can lose like a foal or a calf from being dehydrated. So it's always very important to make sure that they're always well hydrated. So just some general guidelines as to feeding an orphan foal. Your foals need to be fed a milk meal 2 to 4 times a day, and they should be given about half a pound of milk-based pellets once they've mastered drinking from a bucket. So then you would just kind of leave a bucket with the milk-based pellets in it. Since foals are kind of curious, they'll likely go over and they'll start to nibble at the pellets, and over time they'll begin to eat more. So after they've mastered pellets, so obviously this is going to be a gradual increase over time. So after they have started eating the pellets, you're going to offer them a 16 to 18% foal feed that you can add in, so that's like another option for them to eat. You could either put it in the same bucket or a different one. By 2 months of age, you want to discontinue the milk, and they should be eating about 2 to 2.5 pounds of concentrate a day and 2 to 3 pounds of hay. And then by 4 to 5 months, you're going to stop feeding the milk pellets. So 2 months, no milk. By 4 months, no pellets anymore. And by 6 months, they should be eating about 6 to 8 pounds of grain, and they should be eating 4 to 5 pounds of hay. So just some research. Dr. Phillips always gives us some research in each of her presentations. So just some research that's been done on orphan foals. It was an article put out, it was in 1993 actually. It was about the importance of milk replacer intake and composition in rearing orphan foals. So during this study, they had 20 foals that they assigned to 4 different treatments. So one group was fed by nurse mares, one was fed a commercial product at recommended intakes, one was fed a commercial milk replacer at high intakes, and one was fed an acidified replacer at recommended intakes. So some results of this study: by 2 weeks of age, the foals that were fed by a milk replacer had 12 to 28% less growth than the mares the foals that were fed by nurse mares. But by the time they were about 4 months of age, they were in the same weight category as all the other foals. And they also actually had a control group, which was about 34 other foals that were fed by their mothers on a farm, and they compared the weights of all the foals, the 20 foals in the study, to these foals. So by 4 months, they all weighed just about the same, but by 2 weeks of age, the foals that were fed on replacers were not quite as, they had 12 to 28% less growth than the nurse fed foals. And they found in the study that foals generally drank from 10 to 12 liters per 100 kilograms of body weight. Just some other interesting things that came from this study: the foals that were fed the milk replacer or the acidified milk replacer at higher than standard amounts. So they said they had a group that was fed higher, and they had a group that was fed the standard amount. The foals that were fed at the higher amounts than recommended tended to develop diarrhea, and not only did they have diarrhea, but they had it longer than the foals that were fed with the standard rates. So foals that were fed on the accelerated amount, they developed diarrhea within like days 6 to 11, whereas like the other foals developed diarrhea from 11 to 22 days. And the foals that were fed higher than the standard guidelines tended to have diarrhea for 6.3 days, versus the nurse mare fed foals, they had diarrhea for about 2.5 to 3 days instead. And many of the nurse mare foals developed foal heat scours or foal heat diarrhea. So just in general, it seems that it's better that you feed your foal with a nurse mare, but again, we talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages of that, and sometimes that's not something that's always possible. So kind of just a summary overall, it's best to have a nurse mare if your situation allows it. This is because the mare will be able to take care of the foal. You won't have to do it. It kind of helps with them not having any bad behaviors. Foals generally consume 20 to 30% of their body weight in milk per day. 4 to 5 gallons is what should be fed for like a light breed, and 6 to 8 for draft breeds. And this is generally about 2 to 4 meals per day. Some other things that are pretty important: ample exercise is needed to encourage proper growth of the musculoskeletal system. Also, some behaviors like suckling, whether it's on other foals that are around, on the umbilical stump, the prepuce, the penis, the stifle, or ears of other foals. It can happen, but it's generally uncommon. And generally, this is something that will go away over time, so it shouldn't be worried about. And really, it's the best thing to make sure that your foal is properly socialized. So if you have an orphan foal, if you can keep it with foals that are similar in its age, it's good because it kind of gives them a chance to learn how to be a foal, to be a horse. If not, your next best choice would be a really tolerant, laid-back gelding that might put up with all the little foal behaviors and jumping on it and bothering it. And if not, another mare that could be around that might try to take care of the foal but not like be over the top, but just to teach the foal how to have like companion and social skills with other horses. It's kind of interesting if you have ever seen an orphan foal or a foal that was read kind of, or that was raised kind of by people, they can kind of tend to be kind of odd and not necessarily socialize with the other horses if you put them out in a group, and they don't have the greatest understanding of like boundaries between people. And whenever you see them interacting with other horses, they a lot of times don't have very good interaction with the other horses as well, because they weren't raised and didn't learn like the natural behaviors that their mother would have taught them. So, and if you have any issues with your orphan foal and you have any questions, it's always good to ask your vet, or if you have someone that specializes in nutrition that could help you, that's always good too. So this was the end of my presentation on feeding an orphan foal. If you have any questions, you could post them in the forum.